welcome all of you. And thank you for tuning in. We know it's a sacrifice on a day like today to sit in front of Zoom. And when we would all love to be outdoors, but it only lasts for an hour, and we're going to hear some really good talk and information, and Carol will speak more about that in a minute. I do want to encourage everyone who is a member to read their voter. Ophelia is doing a wonderful job with it, and the board is doing a lot of work and contributing articles, which has a great deal of information of what we are doing and also what is coming up. So if you could just pay attention, and sometime in mid-month, you'll get it in your email box. And if you're not a member, I encourage you to become a member, and I will put the link in the chat. And with that, I'll turn it over to Carol.
Well, you're right. It is a gorgeous day out there, but I'm going to promise you that you are going to be just as rewarded being in here listening to Vanessa, because I have known Vanessa since she was, I think, a sophomore at Vanderbilt when she was in my class. And she is an amazing speaker and incredibly knowledgeable. She is Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs at Vanderbilt, and she has a long history of examining and exploring presidential rhetoric, and she's going to take us on a wonderful history tour of the impact that presidential rhetoric has and has not had on our country through the years. With at the end, maybe even talking about the most recent presidential rhetoric that we were fortunate enough or unfortunate enough, depending on which side you're on, to hear on Tuesday. So. With that, Vanessa Beasley, we are delighted to have you. Oh, and two little pieces of information. She got her graduate degree. Her undergraduate degree is from Vanderbilt, and her graduate degree are from University of Texas. Yeah, there you go. And she's really kind of a Texan at heart, but she has acclimated very, very well to Nashville after being here for as long as she's been here. So she's a wonderful human being, and I think you'll enjoy her. Vanessa, it's all yours.
Thank you, Carol. What a lovely introduction. I am going to start by expressing my gratitude to this organization. I'm a big fan of your current state, of your current activities, and also your history and your mission. So thank you for being a member and for what you're doing for our democracy, honestly. I also want to say, Carol, I'm going to correct a few things. Carol, I'm not a native Texan, but I married one, and I didn't read the fine print. So, both my children were born there. There's a long history of staying in Texas, but I'm from Florida and have lived throughout the Southeast, and I'm happy to come back to Vanderbilt in 2007 to join the faculty. So I'm going to share my slides. After doing this for this long, you'd think you get better at it. Can everybody hear me? Whoops. Can everybody hear me if you'll thumbs? Okay, great, thanks. Let me, great. It keeps messing up. Okay, this is the title that Carol and I decided on, and I think you read in the description. We're also going to talk about whether or not any of this matters. So we are going to do a broad historical overview. I do want you to know a couple of things about me. One is I'm actually Vice Provost for Academic Affairs and Dean of Residential Faculty. We have wonderful people at Vanderbilt working with student affairs, and I want them to get credit for that. So, so that's my title. What that really means is that I have a lot of responsibility across all of our 4 schools and undergraduate degree granting schools and colleges for undergraduate education. And since that was where I was an undergraduate, it gives me a lot of pleasure. As Carol said, I graduated from Vanderbilt in the 80s. Very proud of how much it's changed since then. And then, as Carol also mentioned, in 2007, I got to come back as a faculty member of the Communication Studies faculty, which meant that I got to go from being her student to her colleague. And what a huge gift that's been to me in many, many ways. So thank you again to Carol for this invitation. I also want to give some broad strokes of what I study so that you have a sense of where I'm coming from. This is less about me and more about my slideshow keeps going. Okay. Pause. Whoops. Okay, y'all, we're going to start again. Start from current slide. Play from current slide. There we go. Okay. Can you see that? Great. Okay. So I want you to know a couple of things about my research. One is I'm interested in the presidency, and I'm not necessarily all that interested in individual presidents. And that means if you thought today was going to be the day you learned all the secrets about Grover Cleveland, this is not the talk for you. You might as well just go back outside. I'm interested in the institution and how it's changed or not over time, and especially how that change has been interactive or generative or in response to other U.S. institutions and how they've changed. We'll talk about that a lot today. And the last thing is, much like your organization, I of course myself have political feelings and views, but as a scholar and in terms of the talk I'll be giving today, I'm not really interested in ideological analysis in a really narrow sense. So partisanship, for example, is not, some people choose what they study because they have very strong political beliefs. And again, I certainly have them, but I don't approach this work with my own political beliefs at the forefront. I'm interested, as you'll see, in history and how things have changed and what the implications of those changes are for democracy. To that end, you may notice that in my examples today, I will give examples from both Republicans and Democrats. And I will also tell you before we get started that there's almost nothing in the history of presidential rhetoric, good or bad, that a Republican has done that a Democrat hasn't, and vice versa. So as we'll talk about today, as the history goes, so goes the field. All right, so I wanted to get started in the beginning. In the beginning, of course, there was Washington, and this is a famous painting by an Italian artist of Washington's swearing in, if you will. And the idea, of course, was very much on the minds of the founders that the presidency would be something original, but it would not be a monarchy, right? That was their frame of reference, and that's what they were trying to avoid. The reason that matters for my talk today is actually related to the safeguards they tried to build in around the presidency in particular. So you may know that Article 1 of the Constitution lays out what the presidency is and is not, and the presidential powers are all laid out there. But it's also important to talk about the First Amendment to the Constitution in the context of today, because when the founders were putting together what they thought the vision of the presidency was, they did believe that the president should be criticized or could be open to criticism. And the relationship between Article 1 and the First Amendment, of course, adopted much later, is that at their time in Britain, if you ran a press and you were criticizing the crown, your taxes could go up just on your press, right? There are going to be penalties for criticizing the crown, criticizing the monarchy. So when they were talking about freedom of press and safeguarding the presidency, what they were thinking about is kind of a little bit of attention, if you will. They thought that that robust discussion and criticism would help the office. And they also wanted to make sure there was no way that the press, as it was going to develop in the new nation, would have that same risk of penalty. That's what they meant by freedom of the press. You could criticize the government. Now, I know you all know that, but a lot of people don't realize that's really all that guarantees, as you can criticize the government, right? So I want you to keep that in mind, because from the very beginning, the founders realized there was a relationship between who the president was, and more importantly, what the office would become, and its ability to send messages to the nation, to the world, and in their mind, and this is the kicker, most importantly to Congress. They thought the president's role was, and when it came to public speaking, public rhetoric, they thought the audience that would be most appropriate for the president was Congress. And if you think about that, that has an analog that also goes back to the monarchy, right? The king's speech to parliament, right? This idea that there's a body that, even though the king was not a part of parliament, would speak to that assembled body. The deliberation that the founders imagined was, with regard to the presidency, was that the president would have those executive powers and speak to Congress from time to time, as you know, it says in the Constitution. So that was the beginning frame. And the reason I want to start there is very specifically, the founders had no idea that there would be an occasion upon which the president would actually speak. And I mean that in the oral sense or in the print sense, to all the American people. So let me make that point a different way. When we're talking about presidential rhetoric and whether or not it matters what a president says, it would not have occurred to the founders that the president's voice, a president's message, a president's words would be circulated to all the American people. And I know we're going to talk a lot about technology today, so I hope my point is clear. I don't mean they didn't imagine television, although I'm sure they didn't. I mean, they could not have imagined there was a time when the thoughts and words of this person would have circulated to all the people. Now, in one sense, that's really obvious, because what we think of today as all the people, most of which in that time would not have been considered citizens, right? So enslaved people, right, wouldn't have been considered part of the audience for the presidency, even though they were very active and populous in the country at the time. And also, even though women were considered citizens, they wouldn't have been considered an appropriate audience for the president, because they would have been presumed to be better in the private sphere, as I know you know, right? Which is one of the many reasons women's political agency is so important. So when we look at this picture and we see Washington being sworn in, it's really important to remember those people behind him. That's kind of the audience that they were imagining that the presidency would have. And I won't belabor that, but I think it's really important for where we're going to go. That's also why, even if you're a big reader of history and historical biography, you may notice there are very few speeches from the founding period that we look back on, or that authors look back on and say, wow, that was a great speech. Very few. Washington's inaugural and probably Washington's farewell are two of the most notable of the time. But we don't talk about these as if they are great moments in oratory, because for the most part, they haven't been remembered and taught as singular examples of the presidency. That's just not how it worked. So if that's on the side of how it worked then, and the president was, again, presumed mostly to be speaking to members of Congress, I also want to make really clear that the other thing that's been there since the beginning is political media. So if you leave with nothing else today, I want the larger point underlying this talk is we can't understand the presidency or presidential rhetoric without also understanding media, because it's through media that we know these things. And I know that's one of those things that sounds really obvious, but I hope today we'll start to think a little bit more deeply about that together, because it is a paradox of American life and a paradox of American democracy. Everybody says they hate the media. I mean, I study it and I've said that before too. And yet, we have to have it to get information in a democracy. I mean, if you've ever lived in a society where there's state-run media, you know that that's not an alternative that's healthy to democracy. And if you've ever thought about, even when we talk and complain sometimes about partisan media in the nation today, you know that that's actually really baked into our history as partisan media. And that's where I want to start. There's always been political media in the United States, precisely because that's what the founders thought would be good for the nation, a robust sense of argument. Now, again, for them, that meant mostly male landowners who could read and who could engage in those arguments, who had enough leisure time actually to engage in those arguments. But it was also true that when they thought about political media and political discourse, even if they were reading things about their presidents or presidential candidates, they were through pamphlets and tracts such as this one that I'm sure you've heard of, Common Sense by Thomas Paine, published in 1776, before there was United States media. But this is kind of the precursor to what those early newspapers would have even looked like. And they were presumed to be partisan. So if you've ever lived in a place that still has a party's name in its newspaper title, like the Tallahassee Democrat, that's because the origin of newspapers in this country was, and I mean back to the 18th century, was assumed to be partisan. Why am I talking about political media? Well, again, because we can't understand if presidential rhetoric matters without thinking about it. And also, I want you to think of two swirling different worlds. One where the president's supposed to just be talking to Congress, and one where a very hyper-partisan media is going to be thinking and talking and writing about US politics. And those kinds of discussions are going to be happening really robustly, but within regions. There's no such thing as national media at this point, right? When the founding happens, it's just regions. And what the discourse in your community, how you're invited to understand politics, should you be fortunate enough to know how to read and to get these materials in your hands, would have been about your regional concerns, right? As the nation was growing, the discourse of the nation was also growing. And that's not where we started. It was being invented as it went along the way. Now, I'm going to say one other thing about this before we move on. It's not just, remember I said the president was assumed to be mostly speaking to Congress. It's not just that that was the model of the first days of the presidency that the founders thought, even though that's true, that's one reason. But there's something a little bit more important there, and this is going to matter today. The model before about 1870 was that so first 100 years or so was that the president should not speak to anybody but Congress about the nation's affairs because it would have been inappropriate. And here I do intentionally want to introduce an idea of propriety. That appropriate to the office was the president's correspondence with other elected leaders of Congress, other officials, state officials, kings, presidents of other lands, queens, right? Rulers of other lands. But there was something about the office that should be elevated enough that for a president to speak to the people, again, for about the first 100 years or so, would have been seen as inappropriate and in fact debasing the office. So it would have seen as something that was beneath a president to speak directly to the American people. And if you know much about Andrew Jackson, you'll know that even inviting the people to the lawn for his inauguration was considered scandalous in that time, right? Because it was debasing what was considered an elevated space. So that fact is important too, because as you know, that's not where we are now. And that's what I want to do today is walk you through kind of the steps along the way. But we have to start with that first model of what the presidency was presumed to be, who the president was presumed to talk to, and what was appropriate for the president to speak to or write to. And at this point, I'm using those terms interchangeably, writing and speaking. And the fact that there was already this media that was sort of poised and ready to start to hear when it was time and when this technology was there, what presidents had to say. And that's what I want to talk about next. When did that change? All right, this is where we start to talk about media history. I could have picked any graphic for this, but I just picked this one because this is the kind of radio I grew up with as a teenager. I grew up in Florida, took it to the beach every weekend. So it's my favorite kind of radio, but you may have a favorite too. We could put anything in there. When did that notion change? Well, I said a minute ago until about 1870, 1875. So now we're going to talk about when, as a nation, we started to have this idea that presidential rhetoric should even be a thing, right? Does that make sense? That it should even be something that would have happened, that the American people could have access to. And it's no surprise and no coincidence that time period, the late 1800s, there are also changes in technology that make even the idea of that possible. So you may be able to anticipate where I'm headed with this. One of the changes is related to what would later be called telegraph, right? So that the technology that's starting in the second half of the 1800s, that's going to be the precursor for what we're going to call later mass media that makes this dissemination possible. But I think the less obvious one is the second thing I'm going to tell you about. And that's the development and spread not only of the nation, but also of the railroad. Because this is the time period, think about before the Civil War and then after the Civil War, where this idea, should there even be one nation, is hotly contested, right? A lot of different opinions about whether or not the nation can even survive. And I'm not going to go into a lot of Civil War history in the talk. We can talk about later if you want to. But I do want to draw your attention to that moment post-Civil War where this idea of the fragile nature of the Union coming back together, if you will, right? And that at the same time, technologies about railroads, westward expansion, technologies about communication, all of these things are happening within the same 20 or 30 year time period. And if you're an intellectual historian, it's really cool to think about how these things come together and start to be the platform for what we start to think of as one nation again, right? Not two nations at war with each other in the Civil War, but the possibility of one nation. So I've argued in print that the reason that the idea that presidents should speak to the people changed in that time period was because we had to. There had to be one voice that would speak to the whole nation. And as the technology arose, that became more and more possible. We're going to talk in more detail about it later. But if you think about it from the point of view of a rapidly shifting demographic, even after the Civil War, let's say the generation after the Civil War, 1880 to 1920, is up until recently the biggest boom in immigration in US history. And think about people moving to California, right? Think about what's happening in the Northeast and what we would call now the West Coast. It's still, in some cases, some of that land is, most of that land is undeveloped. But that's a time period where there has to be this notion of some kind of iteration of what it means to be an American people. Otherwise, it's too easy to fall back into regionalisms. It's too easy to fall back into the self-interest that, in fact, the newspapers would have been really supporting up until this era. So it's not just that electronic communication starts to, the groundwork for it starts to be laid at this time. It's also that the pathways for a different kind of print communication. And that's why I mentioned the railroad. When the railroad starts, what else can start? Oh, if I have a newspaper that I've been printing just for my region, I can actually send it across the nation, right? And it's no coincidence. You can look this up if you're interested. I know I'm pretty passionate about this, so I hope I spark some of your interest in media history too. This is when the New York Times starts thinking about itself as a national paper. This is when the Associated Press and wire services start to come into existence. Again, those last 30 years or so, 35 years of the 19th century are when media business people, media businessmen, if you will, start to imagine that there could be a profit in having a media that's nationwide. So I hope I'm not belaboring the point, but I hope you can see that we have to have that network, like a media network in the literal sense, existing, and people have to, consumers and producers, business people have to think about the nation as something we need to talk about before presidential rhetoric can matter. And it's this confluence of the technology and changes in the presidency as the office starts to grow and executive powers start to grow that make it this really interesting historical time period that I've studied quite in depth and would be happy to talk about. How do you even talk about this thing as a nation? You're supposed to preside over something that barely came back together again after a war, right? You're supposed to preside over something in which the population is changing so rapidly, and there are very strong anti-immigrant feelings in some parts of the nation. And yet for the nation to grow, and for that railroad track to get laid, and for San Francisco to become a city, you have to have immigrant laborers, right? So there's all these tensions that start to become associated, they're still around today, with nationalism. And I mean that in a negative and a positive sense, that are really threatening the union at that point. So that's why this notion of a president was supposed to speak to the people changed. Some people say it's Woodrow Wilson. It's a you know, how academics love to argue about little teeny tiny things. Some people say this changed with Woodrow Wilson. Some people say it changed with Theodore Roosevelt. I'm in the Wilson camp. It doesn't matter what you think. I mean, I care what you think, but it doesn't matter which president. But the point is, it's not because Woodrow Wilson or Theodore Roosevelt were just amazing communicators and all of a sudden everybody wanted to know what the president said. You get that point, right? It's because the idea of the nation that had been under threat was starting to become more and more important. And we haven't even talked about foreign affairs, and I'd be happy to get in that later. I just mean from an economic and domestic sense. So that's when that started to change. How was a president supposed to talk to the people? The last thing I'll say is, you know, the Constitution's pretty quiet on this. The one thing it says is from time to time, the president will address Congress. Now we call that the State of the Union address. But for most of the history of the United States, it was not delivered orally. It was written and delivered to Congress in writing. It still is. And Calvin Coolidge experimented with giving a speech about it. But it's a fairly recent, well, second half of our democratic history where we consider that a key moment when the president speaks to the people. Because again, in the first half of the presidency, it would have been only a message to Congress. But there's nothing else in the Constitution that says a president should speak to the people, right? So it's just a function of custom that we come to think of that as a special occasion. And it's also a function of this growing media environment that I want to talk to you about. So how was a president supposed to speak to the people? Constitution would say rarely. Media technology would say more often than not. And I will tell you, without getting too deep in the weeds, as media technologies have grown, the expectations for how presidents are supposed to speak and how often they are supposed to speak have grown too, right? So both institutions growing rapidly at the same time. And how was that supposed to work? Okay. You may be familiar with these images. This is the image from the first debate in 1960 that was a presidential debate that was televised. You know the two figures there, I assume. By the way, you'll notice that all of my photos have an attribution at the bottom for Creative Commons, which means we are not violating any kind of copyright law when we show these images. I just wanted you to know that. So this is an image that's taken from the first of four presidential debates between Nixon and Kennedy. And the reason I have this up for my how was that supposed to work slide is this. when communication technologies change, particularly in US democracy, but arguably in any democracy, there's always this idea that, oh my gosh, this new communication, this new mass media, whatever it is, from telegraph to radio to television to the internet, the first thing the champions of it say is it's going to make democracy better. It's going to make it better because it's going to make it more, it's going to make the candidates have to speak to us. It's going to make things more transparent. We're going to get more information. Remember that piece I talked about before? How's anybody supposed to get political information? You have to have media. So every time there's a new technology, somebody who's the proponent of it says, this is pro-democracy, little d, right? This is going to help. You can imagine, because of the way I'm setting this up, there's another side to that argument. And you can imagine, because you've lived through the times we've lived through, there's another side to that argument. But I want you to think about 1960 and how new this is. And I put this image up for reasons you know well, I suspect. You've heard the old canard that for people who heard this there were 4 debates again, so I don't want to be confusing. This was the first of the 4. For people who heard it on, this was September 1960. For people who heard it on the radio, they thought you could shout it out, or I guess put in the chat. If you heard that debate on the radio, you know what I'm going to say. You thought Nixon won, right? That's what we say about this story. If you saw it on television, you thought the Kennedy won. And there's some debate about, how public opinion really shook out that way. But I think that's an important moment in media history. Thank you, Kieran. I think it's an important part of media history that we start to think about this in terms of that story and those presuppositions. So I would tell you right now, for example, that even if I hadn't known this was the picture from the first debate, by making sure it was before I talked to you, I could have known that, because now there's a story about Nixon's suit. You may have heard this, that Nixon's suit was too light for television, right? And you can see here, this is the only time in those 4 debates he wore a gray suit. So where am I headed with this? Oh, it's also that we start having different standards for what presidential rhetoric is supposed to be, or what it's even supposed to look like. So let's go backwards a little bit. When it's first circulating, think about Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt and some of the presidents of that era. They're right. If you've ever, please don't do this because it's dreadfully boring, but if you ever read State of the Unions or even presidential speeches from that era, they are like reading legal documents. They are, the argument is this, here are all the reasons, here's all the evidence, here's the statistics from the census. They're very much like I would teach students to argue in a classical, syllogism kind of way, right? Like major premise, minor premise, conclusion. And presidents were speaking that way because that's how they were educated, but also because that was the assumption about how you made arguments. The other ways presidents would have spoke at that time, interestingly enough, might have also sounded a little bit like a sermon, because that's also how political leaders were taught to speak at that time. But then when television comes on, and you already know the punchline, we start to think about, well, is it really about what they say, or is it about what they look like, right? And you know the whole story that Nixon had a surgery. He had a fever that day. He was sweaty. And you also know that there was this sense of the fact that the age difference was perceived to be a big deal. And Kennedy, of course, is so telegenic. So I put this slide up in this case because how was it supposed to work? Why would we have televised debates? Actually understand that there's some concern that we won't have them moving forward. I have mixed feelings about that. We can talk about that in the Q&A too. But the idea was it's supposed to be a chance to see them argue against each other. Who knew more facts? Who had better evidence, right? Who could stake a claim or had a better plan for foreign policy? And even at the first iteration, it turned into something or opened the door for something else, right? Which was less about argument, less about substantive discussion, and more about image or style. Now, I don't want to paint a too bleak picture because I told you I was going to give you examples in all directions. I, for one, think there have been times when, especially in those early days, televised presidential rhetoric worked. And my example is this example. This is Lyndon Johnson. Whenever I talk about what Lyndon Johnson is the example of when presidential rhetoric worked, I always take care to mention that it shouldn't have worked for him if we go by the standard we just talked about. Why? Would you want to come after John Kennedy if this is what you looked like as president, right? No, you would not. And Lyndon Johnson is important to me. I've studied him a lot. But I mean, think about it, right? in addition to the incredibly tragic conditions by which he assumed the presidency, it's also the case that he's taking over after like this exciting, incredibly telegenic person, right? A person with a lot of charisma that comes before him, and inheriting a lot of public policy problems. This is before Vietnam, but you may be aware of the civil rights work that the Kennedy administration was interested in, right? That came before Johnson. And there were lots of other domestic problems that he had to think about too. So when I say, did that model work of like new technology, more opportunity for democracy, and use Lyndon Johnson, I'm going to argue that it worked in a very specific sense, in a very specific way, at a very specific time. And I'm going to argue that Lyndon Johnson's speech of March 15th, 1965, his voting rights address, which I chose in part because you're the League of Women Voters, but also in part because I think this is a pretty great example of presidential rhetoric functioning in the way it's supposed to in a mediated age. That it did what it needed to do. So let me set the table for that a little bit, and I'm mindful of the time. If you know much about this address, you know that it was a March 15th, 1965 special message to Congress, not a State of the Union, not scheduled. You also know that it happened about a little over a week after the march and the violence in Selma, Alabama, right? The march over the bridge in Selma. And so one thing that many of us have argued, I would say this too, is that presidential rhetoric worked on a media platform in that moment, because what had the nation seen the week before? They'd seen the images of John Lewis, right, getting hit over the head with a bat by a state trooper. They'd seen the image of other Black people on the ground with wiping their eyes out because of tear gas. They'd also seen images for months before of some of the work of Dr. King and his associates in their nonviolent protests, where over and over again, Black bodies and Black people were subject to police violence. And so that set the stage visually, many people have argued, and many people have written about King's awareness of this, for people who had considered themselves, and here I mean white moderates that King talked about, unwilling to get involved in race work at that time, that they said, I actually know more, right? And one fun thing I've done, just as a side note as a researcher, is go to the Johnson Library and look through all the letters and telegraphs that people sent to the president after what happened Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama. And time after, I mean, hundreds of telegrams that say things like, Mr. President, I don't like you. I don't want you to succeed on anything else. I didn't think of myself as somebody who cared about the races. But I can't stand what's happening in Alabama, right? So Johnson knew he had this occasion, and he spoke to Congress on television. If you want something fun to do, go watch that speech. My students can hardly tolerate it because he speaks so slow and his long drawl, but it's an amazing speech. And he basically says, you know, and this is not a quote, but it's close to it. You know, racism is not a Southern problem or a Northern problem. It is an American problem, and we are going to do something to fix it. Now, if you know the history of this area, you know that the Voting Rights Act was something he was not able to get passed before he was able to get the Civil Rights Act. So this was the last piece of that legislation. But the big top line story for me before we go further with you today is, I would say this is an example of, even in a mediated environment, the president speaking to the people worked, because it put pressure on Congress and people signed off on the voting rights bill. Listen to what I said. It didn't work because it changed public opinion. Arguably, he already had public opinion on his side, right? Arguably, even though that's a debatable claim. But many people, and I'm one of them, would say that he wouldn't have given that speech unless he'd known there was popular support for it. And the work to do, enough popular support for it, and the work to do at that point was to both give cover and a nudge to the members of Congress he knew he needed to sign off on legislation. So if you think about that definition, it's actually what we call the rhetorical presidency. The president speaks, public opinion may or may not change, but it puts enough pressure on Congress that they have to act. That the trigger there is a kind of political and social and public opinion related pressure that Congress has to act. And that really means that you really need to speak to audiences where you know you have congressional members who will act, right? In the big picture of things. That's who you're trying to persuade. So my answer, did it work? We have several examples. I'm sure you can think of some too, where it worked really well. But other things happened too. And this is, this is the part of the story that you may feel like is democratizing. Many people would argue, or I don't know if I can say many, but some people would argue it's a great thing for the presidency that we stopped seeing presidents as elite figures, just only talking to Congress, and started seeing them as people who were themselves human and could connect with people. Other people would say this, and I don't mean to blame this on Bill Clinton. I'm actually going to blame it on somebody else in just a second. There was a moment where it went from being the president speaking was a special serious thing to the president speaking was a less than substantive thing, right? That seemed like it was more about PR and less about substance. Now, I said I was going to blame it on somebody else and not Clinton. That's because this photograph is from Clinton's appearance on the Arsenio Hall show in 1992. I'm actually going to blame CNN in 1980, which was founded on, or went on the air for the first time on June 1st, 1980. And here's why I'm going to blame CNN for what I'm going to characterize as a slow and steady decline in the standards for presidential rhetoric. This is sort of, if you think about 1960, asking the question, what will win, style or substance? I'm going to blame CNN for putting its fingers on the scales for style. And that's because, as you know, before CNN, there were only 4, if you include PBS networks, that would ever show coverage of presidential speeches, right? And I'm old enough to remember that when the president spoke, everything else stopped, and that's what went on television, right? And I think that's another reason why Johnson's presidency is remembered so vividly by so many of us, because especially after Vietnam started, there was a lot of televised public speaking by the president. In 1980, when CNN was created as the new media model, what that meant was that we weren't stopping anything when presidents spoke because there had to be enough media content to cover that 24-hour news. And that's why if you've ever had to wait in an airport for a flight that's been delayed and you see CNN cycling through its stories over and over again, you see how hard it is to come up with enough news. So ironically, you'd think that might mean there was more coverage of presidents. It actually means there's more noise and it's harder and less incentive for presidents to stand out. So they have to do more and more visually appealing / depending on your view, visually appealing, humanizing, or sort of debasing is the way the founders would have thought about. They have to do more of that to make the news. So then they start, going on talk shows. This is when you might remember the 60 Minutes interview with Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton when she said, I'm not going to sit around baking cookies, right? The media world starts to open up and we start to say, well, what even is presidential rhetoric? Is it only when they're giving speeches, or is it also when they're talking to Oprah? Or, what are we really talking about now? Think about the contrast between this model, and we're still in it, and we'll talk about that when in conclusion in a second, that model versus the founders model, which is this is a prayer and precious thing that you probably wouldn't hear much about because presidents are there to make decisions. My argument here is what happened next is that the media environment changed so much so that it became almost impossible for presidents to stand out. And I will tell you that until very recently, State of the Union and debates have been declining in their ratings. In other words, the networks know when they were putting on debates and when they're putting on State of the Union, it's going to be a bad night for their cash flow because it's hard to sell advertising. And that's how far we've come. And then, of course, we had a president who took on the media environment directly. And I'm not going to talk a lot about Trump, but I am going to say that this is a difference with other presidents. And you'll note that I'm not suggesting that we can talk about this in this moment. I'm not suggesting that the way he spoke was different from other presidents, although I can make that argument and tell you more about that. I'm suggesting that the way he posited himself as the person who would be the enemy of the media was the difference. Because in all the changes that I'm talking about up to this point and how presidential rhetoric had to change as the media changed, presidents knew that. Now, other presidents hated the media. Nixon hated the media. If you've ever read anything or heard he hated the media, right? Didn't invite them to his daughter's wedding. I mean, all this. Johnson hated the media. But Johnson also built a television studio in the White House. He was the first person to do that, right? Because he knew that his presidency would not survive. So the presidents know that they can't survive without the media. And it's a love-hate relationship, but it's a reciprocal relationship. That as we get more and more media channels, they know that they need footage of the president playing that saxophone to sell advertising, right? They need the presidency too. So Trump was the first president to posit that the media was the enemy of the American people, as this says, and that he was the one that could provide that kind of information, if you think about what the founders said, that would be pure. And I think this is why his characterization of fake news is compelling in a historical sense. I'm not saying it was accurate. I'm saying if you think about the through line we've been talking about, then his position was basically saying, I am not the thing that media is going to cover. I am instead the thing that's going to tell you the truth, the American people. Does that distinction make sense? He became what he wanted his viewers and voters to think of as the only channel for truth. Now that puts him in a different position relative to other presidents. And again, I'm sure there are things that I'm quite sure there are things that he said that did that too. But I think it's this relationship that makes or one of the things that makes his presidential rhetoric really stand out, was saying, I don't need the media as my filter. I don't want the media as my filter. And it also bred a lot of suspicion, as we now know, with respect to the media, but also the presidency itself. So there's that relationship between two growing institutions that needed each other before changing at this time. And the Trump electoral strategy to put a lot of suspicion in those places. Now I'm going to stop for a second and say, do I think you should believe everything? I don't care where you get your media. I always tell my students, I care actually that you get media and you get multiple sources of it, because to go without media means you're not getting informed. But do I believe everything my choice of media says? I do not. So I'm not saying that there is something sacrosanct about any of these particular outlets. I am saying that there is no other way for people to get information in the United States without the media. And when we start relying on any one source, whether that's a politician, a president, or one network, then we're in trouble. Right? Then we're back to almost a state-sponsored media. And that's the difference, I think, that the Trump legacy is going to make us confront, because in politics, if something works, you keep doing it. I mean, you know that's politics, and political strategy in the United States is not that sophisticated. If something works, meaning if it works electorally, if it works to get your message out, in Trump's case, if it works to get your message out directly to the people and actually cast the media in a suspicious light and say, we don't want their commentary, then other people are going to do it because it worked for him. So the idea about whether presidential rhetoric mattered in the short term, of course, has to do with positions that he took on policy matters, and I can name a long list of them, but it also has to do with this changing relationship with how we think about where we get our political information. And what it suggests about our future, I'll say before we take some time for questions, is simply that as new media come along and we have this opportunity to think about whether or not they're good for democracy, whether or not they help us get information about presidents, whether or not they suggest to us that what presidents say matters or can matter, it's going to really be important that we think as critical listeners and critical readers, and I mean that in the general sense, but also in the specific sense about print media, that we think about that imperative, right? To say we have to have the ability to have checks and balances, and we have to have the ability, perhaps even as a society, to think about, or as voters certainly, to think about what we're rewarding. I'm not suggesting we want to go back to a time when presidents barely spoke, but I am suggesting, which might sound odd for somebody who studies communication, we might want to be, as voters, or send messages that maybe presidents should speak a little less. Maybe we've gone too far in the direction of presidents speaking all the time and speaking about things that might not necessarily be fitting for the office. And so that's a controversial idea. I'd love to hear your thoughts about it, but it does, I hope, give you a sense of, at this moment in history, we have gotten to the point where the growing media environment, as you all know, itself breeds suspicion. There's a lot of information about the internet and how the paradox of our day is, the more connected you are on the internet, the least likely it is that you're hearing voices that are different and arguing from yours, right? You've heard that before. And so it's time to really think about both that environment and what we want for presidential rhetoric to mean, and whether we want it to matter, and what we want to hear our presidents tell us about. So I'm mindful of the time. I do want to hear questions. I'm going to stop there, and I'm actually going to take the slides down because I want to see your faces too. Yeah, that's just a picture, like a stock picture of me eating salad. It's like eating salad, ready to have questions. So let's have salad and question time. Maybe you have a salad in front of you. And how do you want to do this? Do you want to do through the chat or hands up? What would be the best way?
We normally do it through the chat, and it seems to work fairly well. But let me begin by asking you about the most recent presidential speech that we just had 2 nights ago.
Mm-hmm.
That was on the heels of some pretty catastrophic information for many individuals in this country. What impact do you think that has on how people respond?
Thank you, Carol. So there are two parts of that question. The impact that we know, I assume we're talking about, in this case, both foreign policy and you could argue health news too, because for many people, the pandemic continues and illness, and in some cases, loss of life continues too. So, I mean, there are big trends that we can talk about across media environments. When there is war or a threat of war, people tend to tune in more to presidents. I don't know about you, but as an adult, one of my most concrete moments of wanting to hear from a president was the afternoon of 9/11. Can anybody else remember what that felt like? And that's an interesting thing to think about and reflect on. Like, when do we want to hear presidents? And I remember, like, what is he going to say? Like, I want him to be on, right? So that's part of the answer to your question, is the external environment, if you will, primes, at least in a US culture, this sense of wanting to hear from a leader. Maybe that's even more, maybe that's just about being human and less about US culture. But the second thing that I would say about the other night is, because this is maybe a controversial claim, but this is my interpretation. Because Trump's rhetoric the volume of it was so loud, and he was such a frequent rhetorician. He had so much to say as president, most of the time. Because there was so much presidential rhetoric during his presidency, it's made a lot of people really curious about whether Biden was going to increase that volume, or, even Biden surrogates could increase that volume, or whether they'd pull back and go to what we would call a more normatively restrained version of the presidency, right? I think it's pretty clear that Biden is making the choice to pull back and do that restrained version of the presidency. Some people would argue it's also because Biden himself is not the best, just in terms of aesthetics, not the best public speaker. But I think really what this moment is about is this rubber band moment. Like, are we going to go back to the norms of it seeming like institutionally that there should be propriety in that discourse? Or are we going to, what political strategists would say, and I alluded to a second ago, once something works, somebody's going to use it again. Are we going to go back to this? Well, what you saw, frankly, on at the State of the Union, some members of Congress yelling back at the president, right? That would be the way of thinking about the two sides of that coin. That's more about institutional norms and answers to your question. But again, to go back to the premise of your question, we know that, we know that war presidents, if you will, have the attention of the American people in a way typically that during non-war times, people don't attend to the presidency. And that goes back to Woodrow Wilson and the First World War. Sorry. I saw another question. Yeah, Anne has asked a question about resuscitating presidential debate. That is such a great question. So I don't know. As I said earlier, the networks see them as huge money losers. We know the public opinion data is really clear. They change almost no one's mind. So if you remember from the Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump presidential debate, where I don't remember the date of it, excuse me, but the one where there was some, the body language and the dynamics on the stage were, for me, it was uncomfortable to watch. You may have had a different opinion because there was he was standing very close to her at various points. What happens in that cycle is whatever makes the news is what gets reported. So what got reported is the body language, right? As opposed to the substance. So I don't know if there's a way to resuscitate presidential debates. My own opinion is television makes it worse. Because not just for the Nixon Kennedy reasons, but because of things I just said. The zinger is the thing that makes the news. We've had that that's again, that's not partisan. That happens Republican and Democrat all the time. The gaffe is what makes the news. So I think it's time, and I think this is going to happen through consumer behavior for the American people and voters to say we want a different kind of information. I do have some thoughts about that if you want to hear them, and I'll just throw one out there. I think the fact that our political media is for the most part for profit makes the profit motive and the democratic little d motive and a lot of tension with each other, right? Because what sells newspapers is not necessarily always the same kind of information, even if you could argue that accuracy is stable. The frame for it might be different, right? What's sensationalistic is always going to sell. At least that's the pattern so far in US history. And what I've seen happening in several communities in the United States, two of which are in our region, are nonprofit communities funded newspapers. There's one in Memphis and there's one in Austin, Texas, where community leaders just say the profit media is part of the problem. And what we're going to do is come together as community leaders and basically have a not-for-profit online and print version of a newspaper. And in both cases, it's nonpartisan. So in both cases, they're saying our commitment is to have great reporting and to have it be nonpartisan and to have no chance that someone thinks they're going to make money off a particular frame, even if, even if that frame doesn't have anything to do with presidential politics, but has to do more with like fear mongering about, the economy or whatever we're told to be afraid of next. Does that answer make sense about the debates? I don't know the way out of that with the current form of media that we have.
Karen asked a question that I think merits some discussion. Can we assume that the president's words would also apply to foreign leaders?
Can you ask the last part of that again, Carol?
Yeah. Can we assume that the president's words would also apply to foreign leaders? In other words, the message that I think this is what, Karen, if you're on, you
yeah.
clarify it.
So when you were speaking so much about how the president is speaking to Congress.
Yeah.
But my feeling is early on, we also had this worry about speaking to other foreign leaders because, we did that through ambassadors, presumably, and, guys who were messing around in France, but also presidents. And that really is a lot of what still a president says. So Putin has said it, and then Biden has now said it back.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. That is both a primary and enduring audience, and one that's also been interesting to watch with the rise of television. So one of my favorite things to talk to students about is, John F. Kennedy's inaugural. Everybody thinks they know the most important part of that is his speech, which is beautiful, lovely speech, poetic in its construction. I think a really cool part of that speech is the way they figured out his inaugural team figured out a way to put Eisenhower in the shot at all times, because what was John F. Kennedy? Speaking of Russia, John F. Kennedy was a young, inexperienced with foreign policy president, right? So what did they do to have a camera, because the Russians were watching, that they needed to have Eisenhower right there. They needed to have military right there, demonstrating symbolically that they literally had Kennedy's back, right? So to your point, there's always that, there are always multiple audiences for things, but the international frame on what the audience for any given message is fascinating. And frankly, I heard a lot of that. I'm sure you did too earlier in this week with the State of the Union. I think a lot of that speech was meant for an international audience. I feel for those speechwriters, man, because they had one speech in the can, I guarantee it, like 2 or 3 weeks ago, and then they had to make so many changes. And I told one of the media outlets I spoke to after the speech, it was a campaign speech, and it needed to be a campaign. That's not a criticism. It was not a traditional State of the Union. It did some of the things the State of the Union does, but it was a campaign speech because I think it sort of had to be at that moment on lots of different registers, including the international community.
I would follow up with one question, which is maybe my concern about presidential rhetoric is the centering of the presidential voice as the most preeminent and important. And then that sort of subsumes the executive branch because of the way that the executive branch has become highly politicized and highly dependent upon whomever is in in the presidential or whatever party is in particular. So if there is a way to consider in the future, maybe having them not be quite so prominent because others are more prominent.
I agree with you. And this is a concern in the literature. Several people have written, and again, I'm one of them, that say, it's almost to the point where the president is perceived in narrative television terms like a superhero at all times, or having that expectation. And whatever you think about that representation, it has implications for how we share power in a democracy. It has implications for how we think about citizen agency, right? I don't want to live somewhere where we think one person fixes everything. I want to live somewhere where we talk about our community obligations to fix things together. I think we're in an interesting moment about that too. And we can come back in a couple of years and we can tell me if I'm right or not. I think the fact that we're hearing on the left and the right, we're hearing from Congress, I think, in a different way in the past, certainly in the past two presidencies. I think I'm worried it's going to replicate, like sort of AOC is going to save everything, or, another Congress member is going to say, we can't replicate the same problem of having one person be perceived as the singular savior, if you will. But I do think that it's interesting to me to watch what happens with some of the congressional rhetoric now, because if you think about it, in the antebellum period, the famous speeches of the pre-Civil War period are all senators. They're all senators, and in some cases they're doing things we think now about as really tragic, like the 3/5 rule, right? Arguing for things like that, and it's really interesting, to your point, Karen, to think about how media can only handle one frame at a time, and how all three branches of government are understood to be relating to each other. So I think your analysis is fascinating, and it's going to be really interesting to see if there's a surge in what I'm seeing, and frankly a lot of female voices as sort of being centered in members of Congress on the left and the right now too. Think about who responded to the president's State of the Union on Tuesday night. I mean, democracy is so messy and hard, and boy, we need better tools, right? We need better tools, and we need more people voting.
We have 3 minutes left. I don't know if anyone else has any questions or not that they would like to.
Debbie has her hand up.
Oh, okay, Debbie, go for it.
Okay, so I just have a quick question, and partly it's presidential rhetoric, but partly I guess it's just all political rhetoric, is that we see, I think, with increased rapidity, that terms that might be value neutral or even have a positive concept to them, how quickly they are transformed into something else. And I wonder if you can address that at all.
Yeah, thank you. So there's a famous linguist whose last name is Lakoff, and he says the frame is the most important thing. The frame is how you change the meaning, right? And that's what I think you're talking about. Even with, the classic example of late is the frames around Obamacare, right? Whether you could talk about something as being positive, if it was a method of caring for more people, or whether that frame would be turned into death panels, right? And that once the frame is set, a really powerful frame, and I mean, people who do research on this make a lot of money figuring out the right frame and the right words that go in that frame. But once the frame is set, it becomes almost impossible for the reason you just talked about, right? Because if you're arguing against it, it's really hard. It's like Alice in Wonderland. It's really hard to tell what's up and what's down at a certain point, because the appropriation of the words in one direction or the other gets really, really tricky. So I think, I see a lot of that right now happening in debates over the 1619 project and what's called the 1776 project, right? About what's the frame? What's the frame? And you hear that all the time about conversations about the founders. I'm super careful that I can historically document everything I say about what the founders wanted, because that area of scholarship has been, I'm going to say, abused a lot, because you have to be grounded in a really clear historic understanding. But I think that's all about framing. That's all about a narrative frame or a symbolic frame that seems to say, oh, well, all of the language on that side is going to be taken up by this other side, and now things mean something different. And meanings change. So I shouldn't say that as if it's negative. Like, meanings change. Language is organic. Communication is organic. The incorporation of that into political strategies that started to happen in the 80s is still powering on ahead. That's why we have to be critical readers. That's why I teach. That's why I'm glad you exist. I mean, it's really all about, I tell my students, I don't care how you vote. I care that you vote, and I care that you get more than one source of information. You have to. We all have to.
Vanessa, as per usual, you have shared with us a tremendous amount of excellent information. And I think you have us all thinking more than we were thinking an hour ago about a variety of different topics. And I think that that's your goal, is not necessarily to give answers, but to make people become more aware of what they're hearing, what's going on out there, and how each one of us individually has a responsibility. So thank you so very, very much for a wonderful presentation. And I don't know if you've been reading over in the chats or not, but you're getting lots of kudos, honey.
That's nice. Thank you.
It beautifully, beautifully presented.
Thank you.
And thanks for agreeing to do this for us.
Thank you for the invitation. I love talking about this, and I'm always happy. I think it's really important that we have these conversations, and I'm sorry I monopolized the hour with all mine. So thank you for your questions. I really
That's
enjoyed our
exactly
time.
what we were wanting you to do. Many,
Good.
many thanks. Take
Well,
care.
thank you.
With that, any other comments, questions, whatever?
The only last thing to say is that there will be in April a hot topic again, first Friday, and it will be Grace Stranch from the Harpeth Conservancy. She'll be discussing clean water, healthy ecosystems, as well as this, with special emphasis on the recent McCrory Quarry bill, which seems to have been defeated. I mean, meaning that we get to keep local control over quarries, which is extremely nice. So again, first in April, the first Friday, we hope to see you all there again also.
Great. Thank you.